Behind the image of an empath, there is usually more than simple kindness. It is often a psychological structure formed very early in life, the habit of observing others closely, noticing the smallest shifts in emotion, and adjusting oneself to keep situations from breaking apart. In Jung's language, people like this develop a very strong persona of understanding. They become the ones who stabilize the emotional atmosphere in relationships, even when no one has explicitly asked them to carry that role. The difficulty begins when that role continues for too long. A person who constantly absorbs the emotional states of others will eventually encounter something Jung described with great clarity. Psychic energy never disappears. It simply moves within the system of the psyche. When the part that understands and endures is overused, the rest of the psyche begins to respond in order to preserve its own wholeness. For this reason, the moment an empath starts to become distant is rarely a sudden change in personality. It is the point at which a deeper structure in the psyche begins to assert itself. What has been suppressed for too long, what Jung called the shadow, starts to emerge in order to establish boundaries that were never allowed before. From that moment on, the empath's journey is no longer centered on understanding everyone else. It turns toward a far more difficult question: who they actually are when they are no longer carrying the emotional weight of the world around them. Part 1. How the healer persona is born. Many people assume an empath is simply someone with a sensitive heart, but from Jung's perspective, the structure runs much deeper than that. Their ego is often built around a very particular psychological function, the ability to sense the inner life of another person as if it were unfolding inside themselves. It is like living in a room without soundproof walls. Every emotional vibration from outside can pass directly through and settle within. In people like this, attention to the emotions of others usually develops very early. A child begins to notice that the atmosphere in the house can shift within minutes. The tone of an adult's voice grows heavier, footsteps become slower, eye contact disappears. Those small signals become something the child learns to read if they want the environment around them to remain stable. Over time, reading these subtle cues becomes instinctive. The empath grows up with the feeling that they must constantly monitor the emotional climate of the room, much like a gardener who keeps checking the soil and water so the plants do not wither. Within Jung's framework, when a person lives in this state for long enough, the boundary between their own ego and the psychological life of others begins to blur. Jung described this condition as participation mystique, a form of psychological fusion in which a person is no longer fully separate from the inner world of those around them. The empath enters relationships not only as an individual, but almost like an antenna that continuously receives emotional signals. They sense distance before it is spoken. They detect pain before it is admitted. This ability makes them remarkably skilled at connection, but it also means they often carry burdens that were never truly theirs. From this point, a very specific identity structure begins to take shape. The empath gradually learns to measure their value through the role of emotional caretaker. They are the one who reconnects broken threads in conversations. They are the one who stays behind after everyone else has left, quietly cleaning up the emotional residue that remains. In many relationships, they function like a bridge stretched between two shores of mood that have drifted apart. When someone becomes upset, they are the first to notice. When conflict appears, they are the one trying to explain things so that nothing completely collapses. This is where what Jung called the persona begins to form. The persona is the social mask, that allows us to function within relationships. But when a person becomes completely identified with it, the mask can turn into a psychological prison. The empath gradually builds a helper persona, where their sense of worth depends on being the healer, the listener, the one who endures. They become used to explaining themselves at length just to be understood. They become used to reaching out first because they fear the other person might feel abandoned. They become used to sharing openly because they believe vulnerability will create intimacy. Underneath all of these behaviors lies a belief that seems simple but carries real danger. The empath often believes that if they are patient enough, gentle enough, deep enough, and loyal enough, the other person will eventually change. In their mind, love resembles a garden that can be saved as long as someone keeps tending it long enough. But sometimes the problem is not the absence of a gardener. Sometimes the soil itself cannot sustain what is trying to grow. Carl Jung once wrote a line with striking clarity: "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Yet for many empaths, that journey is delayed because they have invested so much of themselves in becoming the person others need. They live through a form of prolonged emotional labor. Each conversation must be repaired. Each relationship must be stabilized. Each moment of distance must be explained. None of this is always dramatic, but it resembles water dripping steadily onto stone. The erosion happens slowly, quietly, and almost invisibly while it is taking place. The most painful part is that this structure is often praised by society. From the outside, the empath appears mature, generous, and deeply understanding of others. But Jung warned that any persona that becomes too dominant will pull a person away from their true center. When that happens, the individual is no longer living from their inner core, but from the function that others expect them to perform. This is why the empath does not begin as avoidant. They begin by investing too heavily in connection. They pour excessive energy into keeping relationships alive. They come to believe that their capacity to endure is proof of how deeply they love. Yet over time, this very foundation creates a pressure that no psychological structure can carry forever. And eventually, when the structure of the healer has absorbed more weight than it was ever meant to hold, something very different begins to move within the empath's inner world. This shift is not coldness, and it is not indifference. It is a sign that a deeper layer of the psyche is trying to restore a balance that has been lost for a very long time. It also explains why someone who once invested so completely in connection can suddenly move into what others call avoidance, but how that turning point actually unfolds, and what truly happens inside the psyche when the old structure finally begins to collapse, belongs to the next part of the story. If you have ever wondered why someone who once gave so much can suddenly withdraw from the emotional world of others, stay with the next part, because that moment of fracture is where many empaths finally begin to see what was happening all along. Part 2. The inner depletion of the empath. Empath exhaustion rarely begins with a dramatic event. It is more like a reservoir slowly draining through small cracks that no one notices. Every time an empath listens to someone's pain, every time they have to explain their feelings again so another person can understand, every time they try to keep a relationship from slipping into that heavy, uncomfortable silence, a small portion of psychological energy leaves them. On the surface, these moments look ordinary, but when they repeat for years, the nervous system begins to carry a weight it was never designed to sustain for that long. A person who lives in the role of holding emotional space for others is in reality always in a state of emotional vigilance. They walk into a room and immediately sense whether the atmosphere is tense or relaxed. They notice the smallest changes in the tone of someone they love. They detect distance before the other person is even willing to admit they are pulling away. The process works like an antenna that is always receiving signals. The problem is that an antenna that is never switched off will eventually overload. When an empath constantly absorbs the emotional states of others, their nervous system begins to burn through energy at a rate they often do not recognize until it is already too late. The point of exhaustion often appears in a very specific place. Explaining themselves starts to feel heavy. In the past, they were willing to speak clearly about their feelings and take time to analyze the situation so the other person could understand what was going on inside them. But after many attempts that led to being misunderstood, dismissed, or asked to express themselves in a way that would make others more comfortable, fatigue begins to settle in. They start to realize that trying to make someone truly care can sometimes feel like knocking on the door of a room where no one is actually listening. Another shift often appears around the same time. The person who once kept conversations from falling apart begins to reduce how often they initiate connection. They no longer feel the need to send the first message just to keep a relationship alive. They no longer feel compelled to make a call simply to check that the bond is still there. When the phone lights up with a new notification, they may see it, but the urge to respond immediately is no longer the same. This is not indifference. It resembles a reflex of the body after it has quietly recognized that too many relationships have been sustained by the energy of only one side. An experience from a woman named Rachel, 38, shows very clearly how this realization can unfold. Rachel manages a small team at a company and has long been known among her friends as the person who keeps emotional balance in the group. People often describe her as someone who understands everyone. One evening, after years of always being the one who checked in first, she decided to try something simple. She stopped initiating contact for a while. There was no announcement and no explanation. She simply stopped. Within a few weeks, many conversations that once happened regularly faded away. Rachel later said that moment reminded her of a Jungian idea. When psychic energy is withdrawn from a structure, the true structure begins to reveal itself. Once she stopped sustaining the flow of connection, several relationships that once felt close quietly showed how much they had depended on her initiative. Realizing this is often deeply uncomfortable for an empath. It feels like standing in front of a large mirror and suddenly seeing how your energy has been feeding the connections around you. When that energy stops flowing, many relational structures stop moving as well. This is not necessarily betrayal. It is a simple fact of psychological dynamics. A system that functions only because one source keeps supplying energy is not a balanced system. Exhaustion also changes the way an empath shows up around others. They may still talk, still attend gatherings, still appear present, but the deepest part of them begins to withdraw slightly behind the surface. It resembles a house where the front door remains open while the private rooms inside are quietly locked. People can still see the lights from outside, but they no longer step into the center of the house. This is not a performance. It is the psyche protecting the energy that remains. Carl Jung once wrote a line worth remembering: "Where your fear is, there is your task." When an empath begins to feel tired of opening themselves in the same way they always have, others may assume they are becoming cold. Yet sometimes that withdrawal is simply the mind trying to correct a structure that has been out of balance for too long. When one psychological extreme has been lived excessively, The unconscious often moves in the opposite direction to restore stability. For that reason, the avoidant state is not always the true nature of the empath. In many cases, it is a compensatory reaction of the psyche before a healthier way of living can be learned. But once this compensatory process begins, something deeper usually starts to shift as well. The empath not only changes how they give their energy, they also begin to see other people and themselves through a very different lens. Part 3. When the false self begins to collapse. The breaking point of an empath rarely looks like an outburst of anger. It feels more like waking up. It is similar to someone rowing through thick fog when the wind suddenly shifts and the mist pulls apart, revealing a line of rocks directly ahead. Nothing in the world has changed in a single second, yet the way reality is seen changes completely. That moment can be very small. It may happen while they are explaining a pain they have already explained many times, and suddenly realize the other person is still only hearing the parts that are convenient for them. It may happen when they stop sending the first message and notice that no one reaches out. It may also happen while sitting next to someone they once loved deeply, yet feeling more alone than when they are by themselves. Moments like this are like a needle touching the surface of a bubble. The bubble does not explode dramatically. It simply collapses, and the air inside quietly disappears. In Jung's language, this is a familiar movement of the psyche. He called it enantiodromia, the phenomenon in which a tendency that has been pushed too far begins to turn into its opposite in order to restore balance. A person who has lived too long in emotional devotion begins to feel the need to withdraw. Someone who once believed that everything could be healed through patience starts to see the limits of that belief. The one who kept the doors of their inner life open to everyone slowly realizes that a house without locks eventually becomes a place where anyone can walk in without asking. What needs to be understood is that this moment does not happen because the empath has run out of love. It happens because they finally see a truth their ego once refused to face. Many relationships around them have been built on an unspoken arrangement. Within that arrangement, the empath is always the one who must be more generous, more patient, more mature, and more understanding. They function like the main support column in an old house. As long as the column is still standing, everything appears stable. But once that column begins to crack, the entire structure reveals that it was never truly balanced to begin with. The story of Hannah, a 40-year-old woman, shows very clearly how that realization can unfold. Hannah works in interior design and has long been seen by her friends as the person who keeps peace in every relationship. When conflict appears, she is the one who stays, explains, mediates, and helps people understand each other. In her romantic relationship, she did the same for many years. She believed that if she remained patient and empathetic enough, things would eventually improve. But one very ordinary evening, while she was trying to talk about something that had hurt her, the person across from her responded with a careless sentence and then went back to looking at their phone. Hannah said that moment did not feel like an argument. It felt like standing in a familiar room and suddenly realizing that the foundation underneath had been rotting for a long time. Later, when she read Jung, she understood why the experience felt so clear. According to Jung, the psyche always seeks to rebalance itself when a role has been lived too excessively. Carl Jung once wrote a striking line, "No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." What he meant is that real psychological growth begins when a person is willing to face the parts of themselves they once tried to avoid. For the empath, that part is the shadow. The shadow here is not cruelty. It is made of qualities that were pushed into the unconscious because they did not fit the image of being a good person. The right to refuse. The right to feel anger when treated unfairly. The right to say that one no longer has the strength to carry other people's emotional weight. At first, these qualities may make the empath feel as if they are becoming cold. In reality, they are more like roots pushing deeper into the ground, so the tree cannot be torn down by the wind. When these parts begin to surface, the empath starts doing things they never imagined themselves doing. They stop over-explaining their feelings. They no longer chase conversations where only one person truly wants understanding. They also stop believing it is their responsibility to rescue others from their own lives. This does not make them emotionally numb. It simply means they no longer equate love with endless self-sacrifice. And it is precisely here that another door within the inner life begins to open. When the empath stops trying to hold every relationship together with their kindness, they finally gain the space to look back at themselves with honesty. Not everyone speaks about this moment, but many people have lived through it. If you recognized a part of your own experience in this story, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes reading a story that mirrors our own is enough for someone, somewhere, to realize that the path they are walking is not a lonely one. Part 4. What the empath's distance is defending. After the turning point described earlier, a change often appears that confuses people on the outside. The empath becomes more reserved, reacts less, and sometimes appears distant in a way they never did before. Many people see this shift and assume the empath has become emotionally numb, like the very people who once hurt them. But the reality is far more complex. Their emotions have not disappeared. Their ability to sense the emotional atmosphere of others remains fully intact. What has changed is access. What once went straight into the center of their inner life now has to stop at a newly formed boundary. If we use an image to understand it, the empath once lived like a house with the doors always open. Anyone who stepped inside could walk directly into the living room, sometimes even into the most private rooms of the house. But after experiencing again and again that this openness was treated as a default resource, they begin to rebuild the architecture of the house. The door still exists. The lights are still on. But between the entrance and the heart of the house there is now a hallway, a second door, and spaces that only open when someone proves they know how to handle what is fragile inside. From Jung's perspective, this is a crucial stage of psychological development. The process is called differentiation, the clear separation between the individual self and the psychological world of others. Before this differentiation occurs, empaths often live in a state of emotional blending. They enter a relationship and unconsciously carry the other person's emotional burden as if it were part of their own responsibility. When differentiation begins, they can still see another person's pain, but they no longer automatically assume it is theirs to carry. Carl Jung once wrote a striking line, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." When empaths begin to recognize this mechanism, they understand that many relationships that exhausted them were not the result of a lack of love. The real issue was that they had granted too much access to their inner world. What once looked like intimacy was sometimes simply an intrusion that had never been recognized as such. From that point on, another shift takes place. Empaths stop seeking closure in the old way. In the past, they often tried to understand every detail of a broken relationship. They wanted to know exactly what went wrong and why the other person behaved the way they did. But over time, they realize that not every story offers a complete explanation. Replaying conversations in their mind only keeps them tied to a structure that has already ended. So they begin to learn a different skill, the ability to place a period at the end of a sentence themselves. This change is closely connected to what Jung described as the withdrawal of projections. When empaths withdraw their projections, they stop waiting for others to become the version they once imagined. They begin to see the person in front of them as they actually are, including the limitations they once refused to acknowledge. And when this clearer seeing happens, a large amount of psychic energy is released from connections that were never truly reciprocal. From the outside, this transformation can look like coldness, but in reality, it resembles a garden that has finally been fenced after years of being walked through without permission. The flowers are still there, the soil is still fertile, but no one steps inside anymore unless they are invited. Interestingly, when empaths reach this stage, they begin to accept something they once feared deeply, being misunderstood. People who once benefited from their lack of boundaries may describe this change as selfishness or distance. But the empath slowly realizes that the opinions of those who once relied on their self-sacrifice are no longer a reliable measure of truth. And at this point, solitude begins to take on a completely different meaning. It no longer feels like abandonment. Instead, it resembles a quiet room after years of living inside the noise of too many unbalanced relationships. In that quiet space, a new question gradually appears in the mind of the empath. If they are no longer responsible for saving everyone else, how do they truly want to live their own life? Part 5. When the shadow returns the self. But when that question appears, another process begins to unfold inside the psyche of the empath. Emotions that were previously pushed down begin to rise to the surface. It may be the irritation they once swallowed to keep the peace. It may be the anger that comes from being treated like a place where others can unload all their emotions. It may also be the deep exhaustion that comes from realizing they have given far too much in relationships that were never balanced. In the past, these feelings were often pushed aside because they did not fit the image the empath held about themselves. The understanding one, the accommodating one, the gentle one. But in Jungian language, what is pushed down does not disappear. Those disowned parts become part of the shadow. In this context, the shadow is not the evil part of a person. It is more like the dark soil beneath the roots of a tree. The roots must grow into that soil for the tree to stand firmly. If a person tries to live only in the light, the structure of their psyche becomes fragile because they are constantly maintaining a good image while ignoring the warning signals coming from within. When the shadow begins to appear, the empath starts to realize for the first time that emotions like anger, discomfort, or the need to protect oneself are not signs of selfishness. They are the psyche's natural alarm system. A woman named Caroline, 44 years old, once described a moment that made this stage very clear. Caroline works in education, and for years she had been the person people turned to when they needed advice. Among her friends, she was always the one who kept conflicts from escalating. But one evening, after listening for hours to a friend repeat the familiar story of another dramatic relationship, Caroline suddenly noticed something inside herself. She no longer wanted to keep playing the role of the person who fixes other people's lives. She said that moment felt both relieving and frightening, as if she had just stepped across an invisible boundary. Later, when she began reading Jung, she finally understood what had happened. For many years, she had lived through the persona of the healer, and when that persona started to crack, her shadow finally had a chance to step into the light. Carl Jung once wrote a well-known line, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." What he meant is that real psychological maturity does not come from trying to become a perfectly good person. It comes from being honest enough to see one's own darkness and learning how to live with it. For the empath, this stage often brings a very clear inner conflict. One part of them still wants to love and understand others the way they always have, but another part begins to demand protection. Jung described this condition as the tension of opposites, the psychological strain created when two opposing forces exist within the same psyche. If the empath returns completely to their old role, they will continue to be drained. If they freeze their emotions and withdraw entirely, they will lose the deepest part of who they are. So the task is not to choose one side, but to learn how to hold both sides within the same psychological structure. If this tension is held long enough, a new capacity begins to emerge. Jung called it the transcendent function. This is the moment when the psyche creates a more mature state out of the conflict between two opposing forces. The empath does not remain someone who gives endlessly, but they also do not become someone who closes off completely. They begin to give from what is abundant within them, rather than from the energy they need in order to survive. In this state, their empathy changes in a very noticeable way. In the past, their empathy worked like a sponge, absorbing every surrounding emotion until they were exhausted. Now it becomes more like a lamp. It still illuminates the emotional reality around them. It still sees the pain in others clearly, but it no longer needs to absorb that darkness in order to understand that it exists. And when the empath travels far enough along this path, they begin to recognize a truth they had never considered before. Choosing oneself is not a betrayal of one's nature. It is more like someone finally learning how to keep the fire in their own house alive before trying to light the fire for anyone else. Part 6. The Rebirth of the Bounded Empath. The journey of the empath does not end in withdrawal. Avoidance is only the psyche's first reflex after being worn down for too long. It is similar to the way a forest closes in on itself after a fire. At first, everything appears dry and silent. There are no new paths, no visible movement. But that silence is not the death of the forest. It is the necessary pause that allows the roots to recover beneath the soil. If the process of development unfolds in the right direction, the empath will not remain in a defensive state forever. They will open again, but not through the old structure. The first change appears in the way they grant access. In the past, empaths often opened their hearts first, and then hoped the other person would grow mature enough to hold what had been given. That way of living is like placing a crystal vase in the middle of a public square and trusting that everyone who passes by will handle it carefully. After moving through experiences that drained them, they begin to reverse that order. They observe first. They listen to how someone speaks about others. They watch how that person takes responsibility when they make mistakes. They pay attention to how that person responds to boundaries. Only when those signals reveal genuine maturity do they open the deeper door. At this stage, many familiar behaviors of the empath gradually disappear, not because they force themselves to change, but because the inner structure has shifted. They no longer explain themselves to everyone. They are no longer the person who always texts first, just to keep a relationship alive. They no longer share the deepest parts of themselves simply because someone says they need to be understood. They also no longer carry other people's emotions as if it were their default responsibility. These things were once instinctive to them, but now they are placed under the governance of consciousness. In the past, their empathy was like a river without banks. Water flowed in from every direction until it overflowed and carried them away with it. Now the river has banks. The water still flows, but the current is held within a structure. The empath still feels deeply and still sees the pain of others, but they no longer allow that pain to drain their life energy. This transformation also changes the way they love. Before, they gave from their reserves of survival energy. They burned themselves in order to keep a relationship warm. Now they give from overflow. They no longer confuse exhaustion with sincere love. They understand that a mature relationship requires reciprocity. It must have the capacity to hold both sides. It must respect boundaries and emotional responsibility. They also begin to see relationships with a clarity they never had before. Not everyone has the capacity to enter the depth of their inner world. Some people only want to be taken care of. Some only want to be understood. But very few people have the capacity to stand on equal ground in a relationship where both sides must grow. Because of this, the empath no longer opens the full story of their soul to everyone. They share selectively. This does not make them less authentic. On the contrary, it ensures that their authenticity is no longer distributed like a public resource. From a Jungian perspective, this marks the moment when an individual begins to move from an ego that lives for the recognition of others toward a life guided by the self. The self is the deeper center of the psyche, where a person no longer needs to prove their worth through endless sacrifice in relationships. When empaths reach this stage, they often look back at their former selves with a very particular feeling. They do not despise that version of themselves. They also do not wish to return to it. They understand that version loved sincerely, gave generously, and stayed far longer than necessary. But they also see clearly that it confused love with endurance. Pain has taken away their innocence, but it has given them something else in return: clarity. And in Jungian psychology, that clarity is often the sign that a person has begun to move closer to their wholeness. Because human beings do not become whole by living only the gentle parts of themselves. They become whole when the gentle part learns to stand beside the part that knows how to protect. When compassion walks together with boundaries. When empathy moves together with discernment. And when the persona of the one who always gives finally steps aside, allowing the self to emerge, the self that knows how to love without losing itself. So the story of the empath is not the story of someone becoming cold or distant. It is the story of a person who loved sincerely, who gave more than most people ever see, and who eventually learned that their own heart also needs protection. For many years, they were used to understanding others, giving way to others, and staying longer than they should, just to keep a relationship from falling apart. But at some point, they begin to see something clearly. Love cannot survive on the endurance of one person alone. When that realization arrives, the empath's withdrawal is no longer an act of avoidance. It becomes the first step toward a deeper kind of maturity, a maturity in which a person can still love deeply, but no longer trades the peace of their own soul just to keep someone in their life. If you see a part of your own experience in this story, you can leave a like so that more people have the chance to find the same sense of understanding in conversations like this. And if you would like to keep exploring the deeper layers of the human psyche through the lens of Carl Jung, you can subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together.